Hey, thanks everyone for being here. We're going to get started with our fourth session of our federal grants management series. Again, thanks for being here. My name is Emery Cowan. I work with the Watershed Research and Training Center and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. We are glad to be hosting this webinar series with alongside the team from Kelley Nonprofit Consulting. We have Kyle Stokely and Libby Carter here, our amazing presenters who are going to round out this four-part series for us today. I'm going to start us off with a few intro slides so we can go to our session overview. We have covered a lot of ground since early January. So if you'd like to take a look at any of the slides or recordings from our prior three sessions, those are available on the website that my colleague Emily is putting in the chat box. We have them, both on the website and then on our YouTube page that is linked on the website. So feel free to take a look or share with someone who you think might find these valuable. We can head to the next slide. As far as Zoom reminders, we're going to be using the same protocols that we've used in prior sessions. We'll use the chat box for interactive activities. And then please use the Q&A box to enter questions for our presenters to address at the end. We have ASL interpretation available. And again, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to all registrants and posted on our website and YouTube page. Next slide. The Watershed Center and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network do a ton of work around community capacity building and land stewardship and community wildfire resilience. So if you'd like to check out our work, please head over to our websites that Emily is putting in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. We can head over to the next slide. And funding for this webinar series is thanks to the Forest Service and its Community Navigator initiative. And our involvement, thanks to our involvement with the initiative, we've been able to produce a few other resources that we want to highlight, including a navigating match primer and template that kind of goes through just core principles of match and advice for meeting and tracking match. And another one I wanted to highlight was our Understanding Forest Service Grants and Agreements, just getting kind of a foundational understanding of these different funding tools. All of those resources are available on our Community Navigator project website and our fireadapted.org website, which is just a larger compendium of different resources related to fire adaptation work. So both of those are places to head for a number of different resources related to this topic. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Libby and Kyle to take us away on the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Emery. Welcome back everyone to session 4, the final session. And I'll keep our intro short since I think, most of you have been on other sessions and have been introduced to us before, but Kyle and I work with Kelley Nonprofit Consulting. We are located in Oregon and serve a lot of groups in the Pacific West, but also other states too. We have a team of around 25 full-time team members. We work with over 100 nonprofits, jurisdictions, and philanthropic entities. And we do everything from grant writing to marketing and communications to, of course, bookkeeping and CFO level support. Everything from foundation grants to federal awards. And yeah, we're excited to connect on this last session here. So I'm going to hand it over to Kyle to get started on a refresher from last session and talk about what we'll cover today.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Stokely. I am the Director of Nonprofit Financial Services here at Kelley Nonprofit Consulting. Last session, we covered subgranting and procurement. Within that session, we talked about pass-through entities. We discussed how they're responsible for sort of evaluating subrecipient financial management systems, right? So this is, providing adequate oversight to make sure that they're managing federal grants responsibly and in accordance with the grant guidelines. Subrecipients, they have to follow rules and standards that also apply to pass-through entities. We talked a lot about procurement, informal procurement methods. Remember, those are going to be under $250,000, and these are going to include, excuse me, they're going to include everything from cost comparisons to retrieving quotes from nearby vendors, right? And so this is anything below $250,000. Once we get above $250,000, that's when we get into formal methods. These methods are going to include sealed bids, and when those do not apply or are impracticable, we're going to go with proposals. And so this is when maybe the project is going to require some negotiation. We don't know the full contract price in advance, right? So that's when we would use a proposal. Otherwise, we would go the sealed bid route. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of what we covered last time. Next slide, please. If we could, yeah, so we're going to ask you a little bit of a question to get your mind working this morning. It's close to afternoon, but so this was actually from one of the respondents to the survey that we sent out for this webinar. And we talked about this last webinar. If you attended, you'll probably know the answer. So without consent from the funding agency and in the absence of competitive procurement methods, can a desired partner be selected to deliver goods and services under a federal award? And then why or why not? So think about it for just a second. Maybe drop a yes or a no in the chat box, or just think of your answer. And so this is in the absence of competitive procurement methods and without consent from the funding agency, can we select a desired partner? So we're assuming that they're like a contractor, right? And we want to pick them, but we're not going to use competitive procurement methods, and we're also not going to get consent from the funding agency. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We cannot do that. So no, because doing so is going to run counter to the competitive economic principles that the federal government is trying to promote. So in general, when there's less competition in an economy, there's less efficiency. And so the federal government basically doesn't want the public dollars to be used to promote inefficient use of those resources, right? And so you're going to have to still go through that competitive procurement process, even though that's a desired partner, right? Okay, so that's session 3. Today, we're going to be talking about the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, and they have this internal control integrated framework that we're going to be discussing. We're also going to cover policies, procedures, and the control environment. We're going to go over a bit about single audits, site visits, and then just general ongoing monitoring and improvement. Okay, so jumping right into it, so the COSO this is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. And basically in 1992, they published the first integrated framework for internal control over financial reporting. And this was intended for businesses, but it can also be applied to organizations kind of all sizes and types, small nonprofits, large municipalities, everything in between. And basically what this framework is going to do is going to help managers, leadership within your organization implement effective internal control strategies. And from this framework, we get the 5 components of internal control. It's known by the acronym of CRIME. So the C is for control activities. We have risk assessment, information and communication, monitoring activities, and the control environment. So before we jump into that, though, I'd like to get everybody thinking about what internal controls actually are. So if we can go to the next slide, internal controls are going to be basically the process by which your board of directors, management, other personnel in the organization can obtain basically reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives relating to operations, reporting, compliance, right? So this can be financial, this can be programmatic. And note that in this definition, we have this reasonable assurance component, and this is going to show up elsewhere when we talk about audits. We'll cover that a bit later, but basically where these internal controls are being used by leadership and those who have oversight over the ongoing activities of an organization. It's going to be used by them to be, reasonably confident that their operations and reporting are compliant with a federal award or some other objective. Okay. So we're going to start with the control environment. This is the last letter in the acronym, but really it's important to cover it first because this is going to provide the foundation for all other components within the framework. And the control environment is defined as the set of standards, processes, and structures that provide the basis for carrying out internal controls across the organization. And really, one of the most crucial components of the control environment is the tone at the top, right? So if leadership is taking internal control seriously, if they're practicing what they preach, then odds are that's going to trickle down to other levels of the organization. And those individuals who are maybe subordinate to them, they're going to take internal control seriously. Whereas in contrast, if we don't have a serious tone at the top about internal controls, if they circumvent certain control procedures, it doesn't really matter what control policies are in place. Other people aren't going to follow suit, right? So it's important for the tone at the top to be serious and to take our internal control seriously. Okay, risk assessment is this dynamic and iterative process for identifying and assessing risks related to the achievement of objectives. And so some questions you might ask during the risk assessment process, you'll look at your policies and procedures, you'll identify, those procedures that maybe present the greatest risk for fraud or theft. You might even ask yourself, what's your risk tolerance, right? How much risk are we willing to tolerate and still be confident that we're achieving objectives, right, related to a federal grant or programmatic objectives for that matter. Another question, do current controls adequately reduce the risk of non-compliance? Right. So these are all questions that you'll be asking during the risk assessment process, ideally. Next is information and communication. So this is the sharing, generating, obtaining information from internal and external stakeholders is going to be crucial to the ongoing success of your organization's internal controls. It helps to have adequate information and communication among these stakeholders to eliminate information asymmetries, right? Because this is going to not only mitigate risk, but it's going to improve efficiency across the departments, right? And the more efficient the departments are, the fewer costs that are involved in dealing with headaches, right? Compliance related issues, which also opens up more time for you, the managers, let's say, to focus on the important stuff, right? Like achieving programmatic goals, right? There's monitoring activities. So these are basically going to provide for the continuous evaluation of both how internal controls are functioning and whether or not they're effective, right? And so it's going to allow you to determine whether they're operating effectively, and if they're not, you've at least got your thumb on the pulse, right? And we know that if they're not operating effectively, then there are steps that we can take to improve them. Okay. And then finally, control activities. So these are basically just the steps that you take to achieve your objectives and mitigate risk, right? So some examples of control activities: authorizing a purchase under a federal award, performing regular bank reconciliations, working within your accounting system to track budget versus actuals, right? It's important to make sure that you're not, exceeding what is budgeted. And then also reviewing procurements. That's another control activity, right? Reviewing those to ensure that they comply with your organization's procurement policy, let's say, and also, maybe reviewing your procurement policy to make sure that it aligns with the uniform guidance, right? So these are all examples of control activities. There are tons more. These are just a few of them. Okay, so true or false, risk assessment is not an iterative process. So once you've assessed the risks, you shouldn't have to do it again. Think of this, maybe drop it in. Yeah, pretty easy one, right? So this is false. Definitely an ongoing iterative process, right? You should be performing risk assessment kind of at all stages, almost at all times, right? So as new information, as new risks emerge, which is always happening, right? You're constantly assessing whether risks have become whether there's greater risk, right, with these new developments, whether risk has been reduced, right, and then we can go ahead and potentially, modify some of our control activities, right? If there's less risk, we don't have to have as stringent of control activities. If risk has increased, then we would probably, ramp those up a bit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about financial management. We've discussed this in previous sessions, but I'm sure, as you all know, if you've attended, that an important component of the control environment is going to be a strong accounting system, right? And this is going to be more than just the double entry bookkeeping software, QuickBooks, Xero, Applos, any fund accounting software. It's going to be more than just that, right? You're going to need to have document management systems. You're going to need to have some standard operating procedures. You're going to have policies on hand, templates maybe that you use for procurement, forms, right, for maybe travel approval, expense approvals, and all that. So all of that goes into your accounting system, and it's really important to remember that it's not just those individual components, but it's more about the personnel who are implementing those control procedures. Let's say, right, so those competent personnel that are demonstrating a commitment to integrity is going to be probably the most important piece of a sound financial management system. Because if you don't have competent people carrying out those control activities, who are committed to honesty, right, then it doesn't really matter what the written policies are if they're not following them. Right. So really it's character of the personnel who are doing those control activities that's very crucial. Talking a little bit about accounting software, we did cover this before, but so we need a double entry bookkeeping software. Really, any cloud-based accounting software these days will provide this. And ideally, your accounting software will allow you to track multiple grants, right, and multiple levels of tracking, so that we can get as granular as we need to get. Having a chart of accounts, right? So income, expenses, assets, liabilities, net assets, making sure that this aligns with kind of your annual reporting format. So if you're a nonprofit and you're filing your 990, there are various categories for income and expenses and assets and liabilities that are included on that Form 990. And if your accounting software can align with that reporting framework, it's going to make things a lot easier for your accountant. And it's also going to make clear like what sorts of expenses can be incurred on a regular basis, right? What the categories are to help orient, individuals who are actually spending the money, right, or accounting for the grant money. Also, staying on top of budgeted versus actuals, always important, right? It's going to allow those grant managers or program managers to kind of efficiently direct resources and prioritize certain areas over others, maybe, right? If there's overspend in one area, maybe we want to pull back a bit and devote more resources to this other area where we haven't really spent as much. So staying on top of budgeted to actuals is important. It's also a requirement of your financial management system per the uniform guidance. Okay, document management systems, having Google Drive, OneDrive, somewhere secure, right, with limited access permissions. We don't want this open to the public, right? There might be sensitive or confidential information in there. So we want to review those access permissions periodically. And it's also a good idea to keep some of that documentation elsewhere, maybe on a hard drive, maybe on another cloud-based storage drive. It's a good idea to keep copies so that if, in case one fails, you can, have a reliable set elsewhere. And let's get into policies and procedures. So obviously, establishing and maintaining a control environment is going to be important. We want to prevent fraud. We want to mitigate errors to whatever extent we can. We want to be able to monitor control activities. And we want consistent financial reporting, right, across interim periods or across fiscal years. And really, as a manager, you should be primarily concerned with whether your control procedures are effective and executed reliably, right? So really, I see this a lot. Like having an extensive policies manual is good, right? Like you have all of the policies on hand. Maybe you've developed some procedures to align with those policies. But if nobody in the firm or nobody in the organization has, sound working knowledge of those policies, or if they don't really follow them in practice, then it's kind of useless, right? It doesn't really matter if you have those policies. You really do need to implement them and implement them effectively. Okay. So some examples of policies that you should have. We've discussed procurement policy quite a bit. So having a procurement policy that aligns with the uniform guidance is going to be very helpful for you, especially uh, in managing your federal funds appropriately, as well as demonstrating that you have such a policy on hand to a grant manager or your point of contact at the federal awarding agency who's going to be performing a site visit, maybe, or to an auditor, right? You should also have a credit card policy. So who can use a credit card, right? Who's authorized to have one? What types of purchases are allowed or prohibited on the card? You should have an investment policy. So what do you do with your cash? Do you put it in, some interest-bearing accounts? Do we, who's authorized to make transfers between checking and savings accounts or vice versa? You should have a travel policy. Travel policies, so in the uniform guidance, they talk quite a bit about travel, right? So in your travel policy, you should be covering, you know, what are allowable travel expenses? What sort of seats can you get on a plane, right? Like we shouldn't be flying first class without there being a really good reason to fly first class. So those are some examples of what would go into your travel policy. You should also have a monthly reporting policy. So this is going to involve, your bookkeeper, your finance manager, reconciling accounts, and it's going to kind of outline, who reviews the reconciliation reports, who reviews the financial reports, does the board sign off on them? And all that stuff. Okay. And then there's, of course, conflict of interest policies, whistleblower policies, and document retention. So this is all going to be included in the governance section of your Form 990. They're going to ask you, do you have those policies on hand? And, have they been approved by the board of directors, right? And I think every organization should have those three policies, whether you're a nonprofit or, municipality or what have you. Okay, so let's talk about personnel. So within this is ideally, right? Ideally, you would have a finance department. Within that finance department, we would have the bookkeeper, right? And this bookkeeper is going to be, working directly in the accounting software. They have a firm grasp on nonprofit or governmental accounting, whichever is applicable to you. They understand cost principles. We also have a grants manager, right, who understands allowable costs and the budgeting process and monitoring budgeted to actual expenditures under a federal grant. We have a finance manager, right, who's kind of going to oversee the department, make sure that they understand every step of the, application, accounting, and reporting process for federal grants. In addition to that, we would have oversight from the executive director or the board of directors or both. And some of those individuals ideally should have some knowledge and experience in accounting or grants management or preferably both, right? And so this is a good way to kind of to segregate duties, right? To make sure that no single individual manages the entire department. It's good to break things up a bit. At small organizations, they're obviously limited from a personnel standpoint, and so it's going to be difficult to achieve adequate segregation of duties. But you can get creative in designing those control procedures to achieve that still, right? So an example of this would be, let's just say you're kind of a one-person show and you are the executive director, but you also have to, record donations in the accounting software. Let's just say, so we have a donor management platform, right, where we're receiving donations, and then we have our accounting software, and the executive director is taking data from one and plugging it into the other. And then in order to have some oversight over that process, we would maybe reel in the board treasurer, right? And the board treasurer could provide some oversight and do maybe an informal reconciliation of the two to make sure that those donations are being recorded properly within the accounting software. So that's just one example of kind of getting a little bit creative there when you have limited capacity as a small organization. So let's dive a little deeper into segregation of duties. So what you want to try to do, and again, this is in an ideal world, right? You have ample personnel, and you could delegate responsibilities among them. So ideally, we're going to try to structure the personnel or departments so that no single individual or no single department is in charge of more than one of the following responsibilities. So we have this CAR acronym. So the C stands for custody over assets. So who has control over those assets, physical control. Um, who authorizes the use of those assets, who records those assets within the accounting system or your inventory system or your donor management system, right? And then who's doing the reconciliation between, let's say, the inventory system and the accounting system, or the reconciliation between the accounting system and the physical inventory you have on hand. So the reconciliation is often forgotten. I think it's important to perform reconciliations on certain balance sheet accounts on a monthly basis. And so this would involve, your cash accounts. So doing a reconciliation of your bank account with the bank statement, reconciling maybe your fixed asset accounts with the depreciation schedule, right? So performing these reconciliations can help to ensure that your accounting system is in line with reality, right? Also important is designating select members of the board to act as the organization's audit committee. So the audit committee is going to be tasked with coordinating the hiring of the auditor, and they're also going to serve as the primary point of contact with the auditor. And one member of this audit committee, ideally, will have a high degree of nonprofit or governmental financial literacy, whichever is applicable to your organization. And so basically what that does is it separates the individuals who are involved in the day-to-day operations from the auditor, right? And so we have the oversight of the board of directors. They're not involved in the daily responsibilities generally of the organization. And so they are kind of more of that objective party that can interact with the auditor in a professional and objective way. So let's give some concrete examples to make it a little clearer. So an example of having custody over assets is, the individual who's in charge of maintaining the security of the inventory storage room, right? Like they are the custodian of those goods. We have the authorization of the use of those goods. So adding to the inventory or taking from the inventory, who is the authorized individual to do that or to make that, to tell somebody to go, take the inventory out or add to the inventory, who records the inventory within your accounting system, and then again, who is going to be doing the reconciliation between the accounting system and the physical inventory on hand. There's some examples of the CAR acronym. So true or false, the individual in charge of receiving payments should ideally be the same person who records those payments in the accounting system. I'll give you a second to maybe drop an answer into the chat. So the person who receives payments, so let's say you're getting donations in, they should be the same person to record those payments in the accounting system. I'm seeing lots of falses in the chat, correct. Yeah, so this is false. We want to be reducing fraud risk. And so we don't want the same individual who has custody of the asset to also be recording the asset in the accounting system, right? We also don't want them doing the reconciliation, right? So basically what this is helping to avoid is, potentially lapping of accounts receivable or kiting schemes or other forms of, financial malfeasance, right? So we want to reduce fraud risk. So we want to try to segregate the duties of receiving the check or the cash and then actually booking that income into the accounting software. Okay, let's take a break. This is very dense content. We're going to take, I believe, a 3-minute break. So get some water, use the restroom, whatever you need to do, and we'll see you back here in 3 minutes. All right, I think it's been 3 minutes. I think we're ready to get started and finish up. All right. So let's get into the always fun topic of audits. So we're going to discuss preparing for audits next. The best way to prepare for an audit is really to kind of be always audit ready, right? So you should be compiling documents. You should be reconciling accounts. You should be, putting together, the expenditures pertaining to a federal award before the audit begins, right? So along the way, you should be doing these things to make sure that you're not in a very, panic-stricken state, right before the audit starts or during the audit. And really, if you've been handling things incrementally along the way, then you really shouldn't have to change anything as the audit approaches, right? Because you've got all your ducks in a row. You've set your systems up for success before the performance period began, right? And remember, single audits can be pretty costly, right? They take a while. And they are extensive, the procedures needing to be performed there, right? So they're going to cost you probably upwards of $10,000, if not more, and that is above the micro purchase threshold, if you'll remember from the previous session. And so they're going to be greater than $10,000. And if they are, then you need to follow those informal procurement processes, right? So you're going to be, requesting quotes from various potential auditors. The audit generally can be done virtually, right? And so you kind of have greater pool of potential auditors that you can choose from. So getting a couple of quotes, right? Sending out some requests for proposal would be a good idea because they are pretty costly. So, as I said, keeping up with reconciliations, keeping up with that financial reporting on a monthly basis is going to help speed up the audit process, and it's also going to save you a lot of headache and a lot of stress when an audit does start. So, if the auditor is asking, let's say for bank reconciliations for the prior fiscal year, right? Be easier if those are already on hand, right? If the supervisors have already signed off on them, or if the board has already signed off on them and shown proof of review, and you've filed those away in an easily accessible manner, it's going to be a lot easier to get those materials over to the auditor versus maybe you haven't even performed a single reconciliation for the entire fiscal year, and now you're going to go scramble to perform 12 months worth of bank reconciliations and trying to get those reports reviewed and signed and then passed on to the auditor. A lot easier to do it uh, beforehand, along the way. And as I said, storing and organizing those expenses, right? Documentation pertaining to your expenses like invoices, receipts, right? And doing that as those expenses come up, right? So as you get an invoice, you file it in the appropriate folder. It's a lot easier than, 4, 5, 6 months down the line, asking the program manager to provide proof of purchase for, maybe they bought a laptop, right? It's a lot easier to find that invoice the day after you purchase the laptop than 6 months down the line. So doing it kind of right away is going to help a lot in making sure that you have all the adequate documentation on hand to give to an auditor if they ask for evidence of an expense. And really, if your policies and procedures, you have your performance documentation, financial reporting, everything is on hand and it's organized nicely, then you really shouldn't have any issue retrieving the materials that are requested by an auditor. So what's the purpose of a single audit? So there's regular audits, so financial audits, and then there's single audits, and single audits are a little bit of a different beast. So if we could advance to the next slide. They're meant to provide the federal government with reasonable assurance that your organization is complying with laws and regulations and also managing funds responsibly, right, and in accordance with the grant guidelines. They're going to be more rigorous than a financial audit. They're going to consist of not only an audit of your financial statements, but also internal controls over compliance, among other things. So they're going to be much more involved and rigorous than your standard run-of-the-mill audit. The CPA, the independent public accountant, is going to try to collect sufficient appropriate evidence in order to opine on a whole number of things, right? So not only are those financial statements presented fairly in all material respects, but also does your schedule of expenditures of federal awards present fairly in relation to your financial statements? Did the organization comply with federal statutes or regulations or terms and conditions of the award? And also whether you maintained effective internal controls over compliance during the grant performance period. So it's a lot more than just a regular audit in there. And they're also going to file a schedule of findings and question costs, right? And so this is going to include the type of report that they issued. Now, the type of report is that's going to be your was it an unmodified opinion? Was the opinion modified in any way? Or was there a disclaimer or maybe an adverse opinion, right? So the type of report that they issued, they're going to highlight significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in internal control that they found. They're going to document material instances of non-compliance and then any findings or question costs noted during the audit. So a lot is going in there, and a lot of information that they have to sift through, and a lot of information that has to be included on the single audit report that you normally wouldn't see in a standard financial audit. Remember, the single audit threshold did increase as of October 1st. So if you're spending more than $1 million federal dollars in a single fiscal year, then you will be required to have a single audit. So if you're a large organization, you spend a lot of federal money every year, it's very likely you're going to need a single audit. So it's good to be prepared to have that on your radar so that you can get that auditor hired in a timely manner to perform that audit. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Libby to discuss a bit about site visits.
Thanks, Kyle. So site visits can be required as part of your federal award. They can be, optional depending on how the performance of an award is going. So it might be in your contract that there may be a site visit and then they may do one or may not. Sometimes they also kind of randomly pick groups. So they may have a group of 50 or 100 grantees and they pick 20 to do site visits with. So there's a few different ways that you can get picked for a site visit. And so just, knowing for each of your contracts what might be the case is helpful. So Kyle was talking about risk assessment. When you receive a federal award, there's generally a, risk assessment document that you fill out as part of your award and working toward getting your contract and agreement signed. This kind of tells you the level of supervision that you will have to report to, but there are some exceptions with that. So just being prepared for kind of the highest level of supervision is always a good practice. Just like Kyle said, kind of always being audit ready, always being ready for that higher level of supervision is a good practice. Site visits can be virtual, sometimes in person, usually a couple of hours. And I would say most of the time what I've seen, governmental site visits are usually virtual, but sometimes they're in person. It really depends on who's managing the funds and how close they are to you and how many site visits they're doing. And so there's a lot of factors there. So be ready for virtual or in person. So if you're picked for a site visit, usually you'll have at least a month heads up to prepare for that site visit. There's some, some flexibility in there. It could be a little bit less time, could be more time. And then usually you'll get the questions beforehand. So some examples of things that they might do is spot checking for certain expenses to make sure they were reasonable. It can also be specific to your grant award. So if there was a certain expense They may want, like, for example, if you had travel in your budget, they might say, can we see your travel policy to make sure that your expenses align with your travel policy? So, they do often ask for copies of your policy at the onset of your award, but also in preparation for the site visit, they can ask for some, more specific policies too. Site visits are both financial and programmatic in nature. So just, be prepared to answer questions about the program performance as well as your financial management system and tracking and expenses. I like to, whenever I have a site visit that I'm prepping for, I like to prepare kind of a special one pager that looks, has some photos from the program, list some achievements that you've gotten during that award, and a thank you to your grant manager. This can go a long way toward building the relationship. People often think of these types of letters for foundations and corporate foundations, because that tends to be pretty relationship based, that type of giving. However, we've had really good feedback from, a nice thank you to our federal grant managers as well. They really appreciate that and can go a long way toward them being, more or less helpful depending on how friendly you are with them. So, a couple of tips to prepare for a site visit. Hold a prep meeting with all relevant team members. Usually this is someone from leadership, finance, and from the program so that you have kind of a holistic view of the award and you have input from all teams, so you can answer all of their questions, because again, it'll be financial and programmatic. Make sure that your team is aligned on how questions will be answered and what you will share. So making sure that, and, ideally this is done before you get to the site visit, but for example, making sure that your program team is really well aware of what types of expenses are allowable that they're able to spend for their programming, and making sure that's reflected in the financial accounting for the award as well. So that's something to do from the start, but also something to double check when you're prepping for that site visit, that everyone is kind of on the same page there. Also, pulling and fully answering any questions from the materials provided by your grant manager well in advance. Oftentimes when you're going through those long checklists, gaps can be identified. So there might be a piece of information that you need to pull, or maybe you realize that you need to update a policy or procedure to align with, new federal guidelines, or just to align generally with federal guidelines, especially if this is your first federal award. So, making sure to go through and there are no gaps in your information. And if there are, filling those gaps before your site visit. For in-person site visits, if it's allowed, consider inviting a participant or two, so they can see the impact firsthand. Have some light refreshments ready so everyone is comfortable. Those are really good tips just for any site visit with a foundation level or federal level or state level or county contacts, if you have contracts with other levels of government. Just a good tip for all types of site visits. And bottom line is to come prepared. So sometimes that means you have to have 2 or 3 prep meetings with your team if, there's still some gaps in the information. So as soon as you know that site visit is coming, schedule that prep meeting, and kind of get your ducks in a row so that you're ready for that. I'll pass it to Kyle for a quiz on this session. This one's a little bit shorter.
Yeah, thanks, Livy. We like to quiz you at the end of these to see if any of this information stuck. So if we could launch the Zoom poll, there's just I think about 7 questions for you to answer. We'll take a few minutes to answer these, and then we'll discuss.
Thanks, Kyle. And just one note is to scroll all the way down there, 7 questions total. Some folks on past quizzes just didn't scroll all the way to the bottom and missed some questions.
All right, if you could finish up here if you're not yet done with the quiz. We're going to go over our answers in 30 seconds or so. All right. I think we are ready.
Okay, sounds good. Can you see
Okay.
the slide?
Yes. So we've got the responses here. Looks like we didn't do too bad. This is good. Okay, so let's go over number one. So the true or false, the control environment undergirds all other components of an entity's internal control system. Yes, that is true. It's important to have a strong control environment in order to implement effective internal controls. We went over that quite a bit. Maintaining effective internal controls would entail the individual in charge of reconciling accounts not also being tasked with receiving and depositing checks, right? So you shouldn't have both custody over the assets as well as reconciling records pertaining to those assets. Okay, true or false, small organizations generally cannot segregate duties to the same extent that large organizations can. Of course, true, right? Hence why small organizations often have to get more creative in delegating various tasks to individuals in the organization. There's just not as many personnel to work with, right? An effective system of internal controls provides reasonable assurance that an organization's financial reporting is accurate, right? It's not absolute assurance. You're not going to ever have perfect information, but your internal control system should at least provide reasonable assurance that your financial reporting is accurate. Next one, accountants performing single audits gather evidence to obtain, again, reasonable assurance, right? Reasonable assurance that your financial reports are free from material misstatement. It's not absolute, right? There's a chance that they've missed a couple of things, but the procedures that they're implementing are meant to just provide reasonable assurance that there are no material misstatements and that everything is presented fairly in accordance with the reporting framework. Okay, instances of immaterial non-compliance are a primary concern for an auditor performing a single audit. That is false, right? Instances of material non-compliance are a primary concern. That was a tricky one, right? So they're going to be looking for material instances of non-compliance during the single audit. And finally, site visits are generally financial and programmatic in nature. Most of us got that right. Yeah, so there is going to be two-pronged, right? It's not just going to focus on your finances. It's also going to focus on your program and the achievement of federally funded activities or goals during that site visit. Okay, not bad. I think I'm going to pass it over to Emery right now.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. We'll get to Q&A in just a moment, so feel free to pop your questions in the chat box. And we'll bring up this thank you slide again, but I did just want to let people know that we are running an even deeper dive series of trainings into audits right now. We had our first session earlier this week, and we have another one coming up next week that folks are welcome and encouraged to sign up for if this is a topic that you think would be relevant to your work and your organization. I'm posting the link in these links in the chat box right now, and we'll also include them in a follow-up email. But we have a session coming up next Thursday, kind of just again like audit watch outs, best practices. And then we have an entire hour dedicated to question and answer on Friday, where folks are welcome to bring some specific questions specific to their situation, and we'll have our presenters are answering those. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share that, Kyle and Libby, and I'll turn it back to you for question and answer.
Thank you, Emery. Okay, so let's hop into the Q&A portion here. We got a question that reads, if you have an established working relationship with an independent audit firm that's done prior self-directed financial reviews or audits for your organization, do you have to go through a procurement process for single audit bids? There's such lost efficiency in potentially working with a brand new audit firm on a single audit. So remember, this is generally a single audit isn't going to cost you over $250,000, right? And so you can use informal procurement methods in order to obtain audit services from an independent accounting firm. And it's very likely that you'll have the same auditor year in and year out. You're not a publicly traded company on the a stock exchange, right? You're not there's no oversight from the SEC, right, where you have to change your auditor on a I think it's every 5 or 7 years. So you can use the same auditor because these are going to be informally procured. However, if you're a really large organization and your single audit does end up costing you more than $250,000, then it's very likely that will have to be formally procured. But I've never seen a single audit cost that much. Unless you're a really, really big organization, it's unlikely that it would exceed the formal procurement threshold of $250,000. Yeah. And we did have another question about or addressing the implications of audit findings, question costs, deficiencies, or material weaknesses, right? So when an auditor has findings, right, if there are question costs, right, if there's instances of fraud and abuse, so these will be included in the single audit report. And I mean, the potential implications are, I mean, there could be a lot, right? I guess it depends on how flagrant those, violations were, but in general, right, if there are some materially misspent funds, you might have to, repay the funds to the federal funding agency. It's very likely that you're going to have to take maybe some steps to remedy those issues, right? To make sure that that doesn't happen again in the future. I mean, if it's really bad, then you could potentially lose all funding from that agency, right? It really just depends on the level of of malfeasance, I guess, that occurred, right? But generally, yeah, it's going to be listed as a finding in the single audit report, and you're just going to have to take some steps to correct that error. And if you misspent funds and those were not authorized, yeah, you might have to actually repay those to the federal funding agency.
Yeah. And there may be in your audit recommendations from the auditor that are different from an official finding or material weakness, that are just, recommendations to improve your policies and procedures and your financial management system. So, maybe a certain policy needs some updated language, or maybe there needs to be a policy about a certain type of expense that your organization had but didn't have a policy for, but isn't necessarily an official finding or material weakness. That can happen in your audit too. And that really the only implication of that is to, make that change to strengthen your systems.
And then remember, if you're a pass-through entity, you're going to need to be assessing subrecipient compliance and whether they've addressed prior audit findings and whether those have been taken care of, right? So that's something to keep in mind too when it comes to prior audit findings.
What are some good best practices for developing a site visit policy for a pass-through entity? So, generally the site visit will be the same whether you're, a pass-through entity or just generally having site visits. You may, say you're a pass-through entity for a specific award, for the site visit, you may want to invite some of the, sub awardees or sub recipients to the site visit as well, if that's allowed, so that they can speak to, their programs too. But it, I don't think that generally your process or policy for site visits needs to be different. It may just be a case by case basis on who is invited to the prep and who is invited to the actual site visit. Kyle, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean it really just depends on the circumstance. So I mean I think your answer was adequate. It's general. It's going to vary, right, from organization to organization. But yeah, it depends on the site visit or the the awarding agency and all. So
And for those who attended other sessions, or even if you didn't attend other sessions, we have some time here. So if you have other questions that came up following the previous sessions, or just generally about federal award management and guidance, feel free to put that in the chat. Not in the chat, in the question and answer box, too. So we have some time here to answer any other questions that you may have. Will there be a philanthropy session? I know that Emery and Emily, I know that you have a lot of different trainings on your website. I don't know if there's some that are more specific. Looks like Emily's typing an answer here for you. There was a resource shared earlier that was from a different session, a different webinar that Kelley Nonprofit Consulting did that focused more on, foundation funding for groups. It was a custom training that was offered to organizations in Oregon. So some of the examples are specific to Oregon, but we could reshare that resource. But there's some good tips in there.
Yeah, I'll try to find that and
Oh.
put it in the chat box while you all are talking.
Thank you. What is the best educational resource for recommending to board members for nonprofit governance as it relates to federal grants management? I would say a good starting place is for your board to have a really good understanding of your policies and procedures that align with federal guidance. Their duty as a board member really doesn't change whether you have federal funding or don't have federal funding. Their fiduciary duty and all of those pieces. It doesn't change. Their level of oversight for certain funding sources may be higher depending on their preference, but there's nothing necessarily additional they need to do. Sometimes for federal awards, there's a special requirement that your board has to pass a resolution in order for you to apply for that award. So I've seen that as a requirement when you're applying for federal awards. So that's another thing to get your board involved in. Kyle, do you have anything to add for that?
There's a lot of resources online for nonprofits. You could probably find some nonprofit governance materials through maybe like the national, I think it's the National Council for Nonprofits or your state's nonprofit association. There might be some materials relating to governance there. But yeah, it's really good if your board members just have prior experience in managing non or governing nonprofits, right? Experience, I think, is key to make sure that they are aware of some of the issues that come up for nonprofits or some of the issues that come up for federal grants management in particular. So having prior experience is key. And yeah, having somebody on the board who has a high degree of financial literacy could go a long way too, especially in interacting with the auditor, especially if you're a small nonprofit, you have an executive director who's not necessarily very finance savvy, right? Having somebody with that financial expertise on the board can help aid the audit process.
And Lori had a follow-up to that. Most of our board members come from for-profit sectors and recommend best practices for for-profit accounting.
Well, yeah, I mean there are some crucial differences there, right? Especially when it comes to revenue recognition. The accounting does get a little tricky for nonprofits if you're coming from the for-profit sector. But hopefully they could, read up a bit about some of the key differences and still have a good idea of what needs to be accomplished prior to an audit or during an audit.
Yeah, and there are a lot of good resources just online that may be helpful. And it would also be good to have some materials in your board member onboarding packets and orientation packets about the duties and requirements of a board just to be a board member, but then, also maybe I don't know that the whole board needs to have a really deep understanding of the accounting system. But if you have like a finance committee or, your board treasurer, maybe they could have some more specialized training if that's needed, if they haven't dealt with nonprofit finances in the past. So yeah, I think that would be my recommendation. If you make a good faith effort to allocate can you speak to how a single audit will look at timesheet allocations versus how the financial audit will look at those timesheet allocations?
Um, so the difference between a single audit versus a financial audit when it comes to looking at timesheet allocations. I mean, basically, they want to make sure that you're not like overcharging employee time against a federal grant, right? So if financial audit is generally just going to be looking at your financial statements, um, they might be assessing kind of how you allocate time for like the three functional areas that a nonprofit typically rely. So programmatic management in general, fundraising, right? So how do you allocate time there? Is it reasonable? So that would maybe be for more of a financial audit, but a single audit's going to look at the timesheets and determine whether, you've charged a reasonable amount of time against this grant, if you've overcharged, or if the timesheet allocations don't actually match the accounting records, right? So there's going to be a bit more involvement in actually examining those timesheets by the auditor versus a financial audit.
Yeah, and keeping in mind too that for federal funding, if you have staff time on there, they're looking for you to track actual time spent to the quarter of an hour on the project, whatever the federally funded project is, rather than an estimate, right? So, you know, foundation funding you might say, I'm putting half of this person's time under this foundation grant. And then in your financial reporting to that foundation, you might say, X number of dollars went to this person's salary, and that would be sufficient for the foundation. But for managing a federal award, you need to be tracking actual time to that quarter of an hour versus estimated. So I hope that helps. You may or may not have recommendations for this topic. If you currently have a federal grant but are not receiving communication from your grant manager and your reimbursements are not being processed, what resources are available, or who can you contact to learn more about your status for funding and if your manager is still your manager? This is a tough one because we're seeing a lot of variability in communication with different federal agencies right now. Some are very responsive and some are not. And some of it is dependent on the program too. So some programs within a certain agency are functioning normally as much as they can, and some are at a freeze. So I think, continuing to reach out to them, even if you're not receiving a response, looking at who the other contacts might be in your region. There's maybe some shifting of people who are in roles in the federal government right now. So, different agencies usually have contact sheets online that can be found. It can go by state, it can go by region, it can go by program, or all of the above. So, my best advice during this, kind of uncertain time is to just reach out to as many people as you can, and keep reaching out until you can get an answer. Yeah. And I also, some awards, there may be like someone who can help advocate or help communicate with an agency on your behalf. So, for example, uh, another, like one of your senator's offices might have a contact at HUD if you have a grant with HUD, for example. And they might be able to try to get some information for you. So, leverage other contacts that you have in different offices too, if they may have a connection. And yeah, kind of get creative and stay on top of it until you hear back is, kind of all that we've been able to do right now, and be successful in receiving a response.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that a little bit, from a finance perspective, You might need to tap into some of your, backup sources of funding, right? So if you have any foundation contacts or any, maybe even corporate giving, contacts that can provide a little bit of stopgap funding, to, ensure that you have adequate working capital, to continue on with your programmatic activities. That can be very helpful, to ensure that you don't run out of cash, right? You need cash to do things. So, that's an option, I guess, right now.
Yeah. We have a little more time, so if there are any other questions. I think we are through all the questions then. We can wait maybe a couple minutes here to see if anyone wants to ask anything else. And oh, do you recommend allocating time to grants that is unbillable? I could you give a little more context or a little more information about what you mean by that? Do you mean like, admin staff time? Is that maybe what you're asking? Okay, time and expenses to grants, for example, overhead costs, indirect cost allocations, insurance. So, if you have admin staff, you wouldn't need to, and they're not like directly supporting the project, then, but they're more supporting the organization overall, then they would fall into that indirect cost bucket. And you would not need to track their time to the quarter of an hour. And in most cases, you don't need to provide a detailed accounting of what was in your indirect cost. I have actually seen agencies ask for that, but that was at the state level. I don't think I've seen them ask for an accounting at the federal level of your indirect costs. So yeah. Anything to add to that, Kyle?
You have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, right? You would have already, included those indirect costs, the admin time, utilities, rent, all that. And so that would be included in the indirect cost, um, calculation there, and you would only be tracking time for employees that are devoting, efforts directly to, grant funded activities.
And then they say, is it okay to have your full costs within a grant in the accounting system, even if that is unbillable? So are you asking if like one full-time staff person could be under one grant under indirect costs? Am I understanding that right? Like putting a person, like a full-time person's, all of their time under the indirect for a single award? Speaking to full cost accounting, we have a shared cost pool. It includes some admin time, some unbillable benefits.
I was going to say,
I
happy
think
to bring this person on to explain their situation more, if they'd like to do that too. But we can also just try to troubleshoot via the Q&A.
Yeah, let us know if if you're comfortable coming on to speak and share a little bit more context. Or if not, we can do our best to answer. Kyle, do you have any thoughts based on what they shared?
Yeah, I mean, so basically what you're saying is um so recording all the costs that are incurred in kind of performing the federally funded activities, even if you're not going to be, getting reimbursed or charging all of those costs directly to the grant. Is that, or because generally, we would be, are you saying like including designating specific indirect costs within your accounting systems that you have direct and indirect, even if you don't have to report on all of those indirect costs directly to the funding agency? Is that where we're getting at? Showing all costs. Showing all costs incurred in the activity, even if you are not charging all the costs to that federal award. I mean, I I don't know. This is a very particular example. I mean, I think, generally you're going to be tracking within your accounting system only what you need to be tracking, right? So we don't want to like track unnecessarily because that's more work for our bookkeepers, right? So we want to kind of do basically the bare minimum. So what is required by per the grant agreement, right? We want to be tracking direct costs associated with the grant, but we have our indirect cost rate, and that's just going to be basically, additional money from the awarding agency that doesn't need to be assigned to specific costs. There are cases where that does need to happen, right? And you also have to remember that you can't like be double dipping. But in general, the indirect cost portion of a grant are not going to need to be, you don't have to match those costs directly in your report to the funder, right? You're going to list all of your direct expenses. You're going to tack on that indirect rate, and then you're going to submit the full amount, so direct plus indirect, to the awarding agency, and then they'll send you a reimbursement. That's for a reimbursable grant. That's generally what would happen. But if you're doing like a cost study, right, in order to get to obtain a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with your federal cognizant agency, then you would be kind of doing this full cost accounting and coming up with a reasonable estimate or percentage of indirect costs that are applicable to your organization. I hope that's helpful.
Well, I think we've gotten through all the questions. Okay, yeah, they said that was helpful. So, okay, perfect. So just want to say thank you to everyone for attending these sessions. It's been great to, share this information and connect with y'all. And yeah, hope that all of our paths cross again. So I'm going to pass it back to Emery.
Awesome. Well, big thanks, Libby and Kyle. That was an awesome series and just a ton of information. So just as a reminder for folks, we have all of these sessions recorded. We'll be sharing the slides and recordings for future reference. And those who were selected for the one-on-one technical assistance opportunity have been contacted. So yeah, big thanks to the Kelley Nonprofit team for being willing to provide some individual assistance as well. And lastly, just want to plug another quick reminder about our audit series coming up next week. If this is a topic of interest, definitely tune into that. And look for a follow-up email from me with, just kind of recordings and some of the resources that were shared in the chat box. With that, we'll call it on this one. And yeah, thanks Kelley for just sharing our slide really fast. If you'd like to connect with our organizations or some of our community navigators related resources, you can use those QR codes to get you to those pages. But big thanks to everyone for tuning in, and have a great rest of the week.